Okay, so we're on DAF Lamed Tes Amud Aleph, and what we were talking about is when a person declares his Eved to be hektish. Person declares his Eved to be hektish, so Rav had said that he doesn't really mean for him to be hektish because he didn't say lidimei. He didn't say that I pledge his value to hektish, and instead what he means to say is that I want this fellow to go free. It's just like saying, Rav was quoted as saying two statements. One is, I'm mafkir my Eved. That's a method of emancipation, of letting him go. And another one is saying, I'm makdish my Eved. That means I want him to be part of the holy people, right? The Jewish people. So the Gemara had gone through different challenges to Rav, but now the Gemara is we're on the sixth line of the Gemara, Lamed Tes Amud Aleph Lema Kittenai. Let us suggest that what the status of an Eved, where you just declare him to be hektish, is a machlokas tanoim. Because now we're going to see that there's going to be an opinion that suggests that, or actually an argument among the tanoim, and one opinion suggests that the Eved is intrinsically kadosh, is intrinsically holy. So hamakdish avdo ein moalin bo. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel omer moalin besaro.
Thank you.
Good morning, Salim. Good morning. Boker tov, sabach il khir. It's good to see you.
Thank you.
Okay, so the machlokus in the Bryce is like this. If a person makes his Eved hektish, so the Tanakama says if you use that Eved, who's now been declared hektish for personal use, there's no me'ila. So the whole discussion here is talking about whether there's me'ila in an Eved that has become kadosh. And Rabbi Shimon Gamliel omer moilin besaro. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says there is the possibility of me'ila, of being in violation of temple property, but only with his hair. We have to explain why only the hair. So my lav b'hakam iflagi, the mar savar kadosh, mar savar lo kadosh. So the Gemara says, isn't this the machlokas that one opinion holds that he's sanctified, and the other says he's not sanctified? So the Gemara says, "V'tispera hay molin bo ve'ein molin bo hay kadosh ve'eno kadosh mi boiling." No, says the Gemara. If the issue over here is whether there's hektish chal on an Eved or not, and you want to create this debate between Rav and another Tana, then the issue should not be whether there's liability for me'ila. The issue is much more fundamental. Is he kadosh in the first place or not? Me'ila is a secondary issue, that if he is kadosh, is there me'ila? So therefore the Gemara's conclusion is, Ela dekuli alma kadosh. Rather, you're right. Really, it seems like from the language of the Brisa that everyone holds that the Eved is hektish, not like Rav had said. But the machlokas here is as follows: the mar savar avda kimekarka idami, umar savar kimetaltal idami. That the machlokas is, what is the status of an Eved vis-a-vis hektish? We know that in many respects, halachically, an Eved is hukash lekarkos. Servants are connected halachically to real estate. And so with methods of transaction, just like you purchase real estate with certain limited ways, that's the same way that you purchase an Eved. So perhaps that's the argument here too. When we talk about an Eved, is he like karka vis-a-vis me'ila or not? And the issue here is that we know that there's a principle of ein me'ila bekarkos, that if a person sanctifies his field and he declares it to be hektish, if a person were to use that field for personal use, he would not be liable for me'ila. There's no formal act of violation involved. He doesn't have to bring a carbon. He doesn't have to pay any penalties such as exists by normal me'ila. So the same thing is here too. If I use the Eved for personal use, that is kadosh, that is hektish, am I liable for me'ila or not? So if you learn that an Eved is like karka, you're not liable. And if you learn that an Eved is not like karka, so then you will be liable. So the Gemara says, Ihachi ad miflagi b'saru liflagi begufa. Well, then why is it only an issue by his hair? What's the issue with the hair? Just say that the Tanakama says there's no me'ila if you use the Eved for personal use. And Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says there is me'ila if you use the Eved to take out the garbage for you, or whatever you use him to do. So Ella de Kuli Alma Avde Kemekarki Dami Vahacha Bisar Homid Ligozis Kamiflagi Mar Saver Kagazus Dami Mar Saver Lav Kagazus Dami. So you're right. Everyone holds that an Eved is like Karka. And therefore there's no, just like there's no Me'ila when you use Karka that's hektish for personal use, so too there's no Me'ila when you use an Eved who's hektish for personal use. But the question is, what about his hair? His hair, is that part of his body or not? You know, hair is something that grows from your body, but it's really dead after it's out of your body. So is that like being part of an Eved's, is that like part of the body of the Eved, in which case there's no Me'ila? Or is it considered to be like it's already shorn from the Eved, and since everything that grows from the Eved is Kadosh, this too is Kadosh. Just like if you have real estate, and it grows produce, and you remove the produce from the property, that produce is hektish and it's subject to me'ila, even though the real estate was not subject to me'ila.
Can you shear a sheep if we put on the mizbeach, because the hair of the sheep is not really part of the body?
Well, actually, that's an interesting.
Hektish, no?
Well, the whole animal is hektish, including its fleece, right? So the question is, but the question is, there's no question it's kadosh. The question is, are you subject to me'ila if you use it for personal use? So clearly, it's all hektish. Question is it subject to me'ila? So here we're suggesting that this is the machlokus. Is hair an intrinsic part of the body of the Eved, in which case, just like the Eved is like karka, so too his hair is like karka? Or do we say no, it's a separate component, just like produce that's already been removed from the ground? So the Gemara now says, Lema hani tanai kahani tanai. Let us suggest that this is tied into a machlokus that we know exists by produce that's growing from the ground. It's not. Rabbi Meir oimer yesh dvarim shein kekarka ve'enan kekarka ve'ein chachamim moedim lo. That there's a Mishnah that says that when it comes to issues of hektish, using hektish from real estate, Rabbi Meir says that there are certain things that are like real estate, but they're not like real estate, so they will be subject to me'ila, and the Chachamim disagree. Let's see. Keitzad Eser Gefanim. Now this is talking about actually a different issue, not talking about hektish. Let me just correct myself. This is not talking about hektish, this is talking about other halachas having to do with real estate. Keitzad Eser Gefanim tu unos masarti lecha, v'hala omer enon ele chamesh. Rabbi Meir Machayev v'chachamim omrim kol ha'mechuber lekarka hareu kekarka. So here's the issue. Here we're talking about a Choshen Mishpat issue, a financial law. As we learn Bava Metzia, we'll learn about all of this whole halacha of Moda b'miksa satayna. You've heard that term before. Moda b'miksa satayna means that if Reuven says you owe me 100, and Shimon responds, I only owe you 50, so the halacha is Shimon only has to pay 50 if there's no edim, but he has to take a shavua. That's a halacha l'Moshe misinai. However, ein nishboin lekarkaos. There's also another principle that if the claim is on real estate, I gave you an acre of real estate to watch over, and Shimon says, I'm returning your property, but it was only half an acre. So the halacha is that Shimon does not have to take a shvuah. This is also part of the halacha l'Moshe misinai. The question now is, what happens if Reuven says, I left for you to watch 10 vines laden with grapes, and Shimon says, here's your property with your vines, but there were only 5 vines, not 10. So is Shimon liable to take a shvuah or not? So Rabbi Meir says Shimon has to take a shvuah because the grapes are considered to be disparate from the real estate. And the Chachamim say no, since the grapes are still growing, they're still attached to the ground, they are part of the karka. And so there's just like there's no shvuah on karka, there's no shvuah on grapes that are attached to the vine. V'amar Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Chanina, anavim ha'omdos libotzer ika beinayu, de Rabbi Meir savar kibitzuros damyan, v'Rabbanan sabri lav kibitzuros damyan. And Rabbi Yossi had clarified that the machlokus is only when the grapes are fully mature and ripe, and they're ready to be harvested. That's where there's a machlokus, because Rabbi Meir says that since they're already ripe, they don't need the karka anymore, so therefore they're not considered part of the karka, and therefore they're subject to a shvuah of moda b'miksa satayna. The Chachamim say no, anything that's attached to the ground is like the ground, period, so there's no shvuah. So we want to say, based on that machlokus, it would be the same machlokus over here. Hair that's growing from an eved, doesn't need the Eved anymore. It's dead hair. So therefore, it's as if it's removed from the ground, like Rabbi Meir says, and therefore it's subject to Me'ila. But the other opinion would say, no, it's still attached, and therefore it's like the karka itself, it's like the Eved itself. So that would seem to be the same machlokas. So the Gemara says, no. Afilu tema Rabbi Meir, adkan lo kama Rabbi Meir hasam ela ba'anovim. Dekama dekayomin mikchash chishi, aval hacha kama dekoi ashbuchi mishabeach. So the Gemara says, no, there's a very important conceptual difference between the two. Rabbi Meir would argue, perhaps Rabbi Meir would argue, that even an Eved's hair is still considered to be like karka, like the Eved himself. Why then does he say that ripened grapes that are still attached to the vine are not like the vine, or not like the karka? It's very simple. When you leave ripened grapes on the vine, what happens to them if you leave them an extra few days?
Raisins.
They start to go bad. Sure. They start to depreciate and degrade in quality. When you leave hair on a person's head without cutting it, what's the worst that happens? He keeps growing. He looks like a hippie. But the hair does not degrade. There are some people who could use a little bit more hair on their head, right? So it doesn't. There's nothing degrading. There's nothing that degrades about the hair. So therefore, Rabbi Meir perhaps would only say by the grapes that it's considered detached, because by leaving them attached, you're degrading them. But when it comes to hair, you're not degrading the hair. The hair continues to grow. It only gets longer. So therefore, maybe he would hold that in that case, it also is like the ground and there's no me'ila. Anyway, Kisolik Rabbi Chia Bar Yosef, Amar Lahai Shmaita de Rav Kamei de Rabbi Yochanan. So now let's go back to Rav. Remember, Rav had said two things. One is if you're mafkir your Eved, he goes free. Number two, if you're makdish your Eved, he goes free. So this is being repeated, the statement of Rav in front of Rabbi Yochanan, and Amar Lei, Amar Rav Hachi? So Rabbi Yochanan said in amazement, did Rav really say that? So the Gemara says, why is Rabbi Yochanan so amazed? V'hu lo Amar Hachi? You mean Rabbi Yochanan didn't say that himself? It's beautiful. It's like Jews always speaking in rhetorical questions, right? V'hu lo Amar Hachi? What do you mean? Rabbi Yochanan didn't say that also? So the Amar Ula Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Didn't Ula say in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Hamafkir Avdo Yatzel Lecheres? Rabbi Yochanan himself said that if you declare your Eved Hefker, he goes free. V'tzarach get shichur. And furthermore, you need to give him a writ of emancipation. Even though he's Hefker, you still need to give him a get shichur. Not like Shmuel had said yesterday. When we saw Shmuel, we said that according to Shmuel, just by making him Hefker, he doesn't need anything more. But no, Rav and Rabbi Yochanan both said the same thing, that you can make him Hefker, he's a free man, but you still have to give him a get shichur in order for him to be completely free. So the Gemara says, so the question is, why was Rabbi Yochanan so amazed that Rav said this if he himself said it? Hachi kamarle, Omar Rav Kavasi. So what his amazement was is like pleasantly amazed. He was pleasantly surprised. You mean to say that Rav holds like I hold? Baruch shekivanti is almost like what he's saying. So v'ika da amri lo siyamuha kamei. Amar lei v'lo amar Rav sarach get shichrur. So some say that Rabbi Yochanan's amazement was because they only told him half the statement. They told him that according to Rav, if you make your Eved Hefker, he goes free. So Rabbi Yochanan's question was, but doesn't Rav also require the giving of a get shichur, of a writ of emancipation? And they said, yes, you're right, we only told you half the statement. And Rabbi Yochanan is according to his reasoning, because Rabbi Yochanan says, yes, it's true that if you make him hefker, he goes free, but he still needs a get shichur. Now let's go back to that teaching. Gufa Amar Ula Amar Rabbi Yochanan Hamafkir Avdo Yatzel Lecherus B'tzarach get shichur. That's what Rabbi Yochanan holds. He goes free, but you need to give him a get shichur. So Esvei Rabbi Abba Ula. So let's challenge that. Ger shemeis ubizbezu Yisrael nechasa v'hayu b'hen avadim ben gedolim uvein ketanim kanu atzman b'nei chorin. Period. So there's a brisa that says like this. Rabbi Abba presents the brisa to Ula. The brisa says that if a ger who has no relatives dies, we know that what happens to his property, he has no heirs. So what happens? His property becomes hefker, and anyone in the Jewish community can take possession from hefker. But what happens if part of his assets are avadim? So the Tanakama says these avadim also have the ability to acquire themselves from hefker. if I'm an Eved and I am made Hefker, I can be Kona myself from Hefker. And it doesn't matter whether the Eved is an adult, whether it's a minor, the Eved can be Kona himself from Hefker, so therefore automatically the Eved goes free. Abishol Omer Gedolim Kanu Atzman B'nei Chorin Ketanim Kol HaMachzik B'hen Zacha B'hen. And Abishol disagrees when it comes to minor Avadim. He says that an Eved who's a Katan does not have the ability to be Kona, because we know that in general a Katan can only be Kona if there's also Da'as Makna, if there's also someone who's an adult who transfers ownership to him. But a Katan cannot independently be Kona something from Hefker. This is Abishol Shita. And that's why if the Eved is a Katan, then another Jew can take possession of him and he does not go free. That's the only point. We're going to come back to this machlokas in a minute. But the question is, V'chi mikasav get shechur la'elu. The question is, if you hold Rabbi Yochanan that by making an Eved Hefker, he still needs a get shechur, well, if this ger died, asks Rabbi Abba to Ula, who wrote him a get shechur? How does this Eved go completely free if he never got a get shechur? That's the question that Rabbi Abba is asking Ula. So Omar, Dami hai midrabanan kedelo gamri in shishmaita. So Ula responded sharply, and he said, it would seem to me that this rabbi who asked me this question is someone who never learned Gemara before. Now, what he's saying is, he's saying it sharply in order to provoke him, in order to instigate him to try and figure this out for himself. But the point that Ula was making is that's a klutz kasha. That's not really a kasha. So the Gemara says, okay, so explain it to me. V'taim amai, why not? So Amar of Nachman Kesavar Ula avdo deger ki ishto. Ma ishto mishtalcha below get, af avodav mishtalchim below get. So the answer is that Ula holds that a get shichur is required just like you require a get for a wife. If you require a get to divorce a wife, so then you require a get shichur to release an Eved. But if a man dies who's married to a woman, she doesn't need a get post-mortem. Similarly, if a master dies, then you don't need a get post-mortem, in that situation. That's the absolute severance is death. And so therefore, get shichur is only required when the master is still alive. That's the point.
Isn't there a difference, though, in the fact that a woman, when her husband dies, she's now open to the shuk, as they say, but doesn't an Eved fall to Yerusha to
hold on a second, Alan. You're asking a good question. The Gemara is going to challenge this in a minute. But the point is that the severance that's created between master and servant at this point in the Gemara is being equated exactly to the severance that's created between a man and a woman upon the man's death. What about your question about the Yerusha? We're going to get to that in a minute. So the Gemara says, Yihachi afilu Yisrael nami. So that's the question. The question is, well, then why isn't that true by any Jewish man who dies, that as soon as he dies, his Eved goes free? Why do we instead say that when a man dies, his Eved goes as a Yerusha to his heirs? Answers the Gemara, Omar Krav, Hisnachaltem osam livnechem acharechem lareshes achuza. The answer is that because it's Xeris HaKasav, that the Torah says that even though the man has died, the heirs have a right to inherit that Eved as part of the rights of Yerusha. But nevertheless, the severance that would normally be required in order to create that severance, in other words, the get shichur that would normally be required, is no longer required once the person dies, just like a get is no longer required when a husband dies. So the Gemara says, Ihachi hamafkir avda umes nami. Well, if that's the case, says the Gemara, then why don't you say the same thing? In theory, if a Jewish master were to declare his Eved Hefker, in which case he's now created the inability for his heirs to inherit. So what about the get shichur? Now I just want to explain what's going on over here. The Gemara seems to be implying that there's two types of severance that are taking place. One is the severance of mammon, and one is the severance of what we call isur, or halachic status, is what I would call it in English. In other words, an Eved, when he's made Hefker, there's been a financial severance between master and servant. Okay? when the master has not declared his Eved Hefker, if he gives him a get shichrur, he concomitantly with that get shichrur creates two types of severance. He creates a severance of finance, and he creates a severance of halachic status. But if a master only declares his Eved to be Hefker without giving him a get shichrur, there's no financial connection anymore between the master and the servant, but there is still the Isser, the Eved is still halachically, his personal status is still an Eved until he gets the get shichrur. And that's why the Gemara says that if the master dies, then even that halachic personal status of the Eved is removed through the death of the master. And that would explain in principle why when a master dies without making his Eved Hefker, there's still a financial connection between the Eved and the master's estate, and that's why he becomes the financial property of the heirs. But so the Gemara's this leads to the next logical question, which is, what about a situation where a Jewish man before he dies declares his Eved Hefker? So if you're telling me that there's now no longer any financial connection, and there's no longer any halachic status connection because the death is tantamount to a get shichrur, then theoretically, according to what you're saying, the Eved should now be considered to be a total free man, right? That's what you would say. But the Gemara says, but there's a problem with that, because Alama Omar Ameimar Hamafkir Avda Umeis Oso Eved Ein Lo Takana. Why then did Ameimar say not that way? Why did Ameimar say that if a man declares his Eved Hefker and before he has a chance to write him a get shichrur, that the man dies? Ameimar said the Eved is stuck for the rest of his life. He will never be able to be a free man, and he's not an Eved to anyone. So he'll never be able to marry a Jewish girl. Why not? According to what you just said, the death of the master is tantamount to a get shichrur. So the Gemara says, De Ameimar Kasha. You're right, says the Gemara, I don't have a solution to that. It's almost like asking a tiyufta on Ameimar. It's really saying that Ameimar is upgefregt. You know, he's basically, there's a kasha on Ameimar that is outstanding. According to the logic that we've just presented, there is no reason why this Eved should be stuck, as Ameimar argues. Amar Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi, Amar Rabbi Shua ben Levi, halacha ka'abashol. So now let's go back to this machlokes as to when the ger dies and he leaves over minor avadim. Do they automatically go free because they were kona themselves, or like Abishol says, that only works for adult slaves but not for minor slaves? So he says the halach is like Abishol. So Amarle that the katanim do not go free. So Amarle Reb Zera Reb Yaakov bar Idi beferish shemi alach o michlala shemi alach. So he asked Rav Idi, he said, let me ask you something. He asked Rabbi Yaakov, he said, let me ask you something, Rabbi Yaakov. Did you hear Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi say that explicitly? That the halach is like Abishol? Or did you just infer it from a different discussion? So he says, my klala, what inference are you talking about? Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Amru lifnei Rebbe, Amar nisyashti miploni avdi mahu. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi was once talking about something else related. He said that they once asked Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, they asked him, what if a man is heard saying, I give up hope of ever getting back this Eved? So that's a declaration of Hefker, right? He relinquishes ownership. So mahu. What else has to be done for that Eved to go free? So Amar lahem, Omar ani, ein lo takana elo bishtar. So Rebbe said, the only way to completely free an Eved Kanani is by writing a get shichrur. It's not enough just to make him hefker. So the Amar Rebbe Yochanan, my time at the Rebbe, so Rebbe Yochanan explained, he said, you know what Rebbe's reasoning is? Gomar la me'isha. Ma isha bishtar, af Eved nami bishtar. He learns the word law from the laws of GITTEN, that just like a woman has to be divorced through a writ, so to an Eved has to be emancipated through a writ. And if that's the case, then even though you made your Eved Hefker, you still have to give him a get shichrur. So, therefore, if this is what Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is quoting Rebbe is saying, then maybe you made an inference. He said to Rabbi Yaakov, maybe Rabbi Yaakov, you're only inferring that based on that the halach is like Abishol, that an Eved Katan is not kaina himself, because v'kodaikus mina ki isha, ma isha isura v'lo mamona, af Eved nami isura v'lo mamona. that if you're comparing a get shichrur to a woman's get, then maybe the point is like this, that there's no addressing the financial issue of severance, but we're only addressing the personal status issue of severance, which is what is a woman's get. A woman's get has nothing to do with the financial severance between the husband and wife, because there is no financial issues that the get addresses. And so therefore, if you're telling me that a get shichrur works like a get, so maybe in a situation where the Eved Kanani has no financial ability to acquire that severance on his own, that's the reason why the Eved will not be able to go free. And that's what the case of an Eved Katan is, that he doesn't have the financial wherewithal, because he doesn't have das, to be kona himself from Hefker. That's the inference that perhaps you're making, he says to Rabbi Yaakov, and that's the reason why you say that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi paskans like Abba Shol. He says, V'imech lalamai. So Rabbi Yaakov said back to him, no, and if taka, I only was inferring that from Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi's statement, would that be so bad? So Amar lei adarabba dok mina leidach gisa ma isha ben gedola ben katana af eved nami ben gadol bekatan. He said, yeah, that would be bad, because your inference could be also reversed and say pum fakert. You could say, well, if you're comparing an eved to a woman, just like a get of a woman works whether the woman is a minor or an adult, so too a get shichrur and a method of emancipation that works for an adult Eved also works for a minor Eved. And maybe the fact that we're comparing an Eved to an Isha is to tell me the opposite, that whatever works for an adult also works for a minor. And therefore, if the ger dies, then just like an adult Eved goes free, so too a minor Eved goes free. Maybe that's the way you're supposed to learn it. And therefore you have no raya as whether or not Rabbi Shua ben Levi paskins like Abba Shol or the Chachamim. So Amar Lei, so Rabbi Yaakov said back, I hear your point, so let me explain to you Beferish Shamiali. I heard Rabbi Shua ben Levi say it explicitly. He said explicitly the halacha is like Abba Shol, that the Eved Katan does not go free. V'Rebbi Chia bar Abba Omar Rabbi Yochanan ein halacha ka'Abba Shol. Now, Rabbi Chia bar Abba said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, not in the name of Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, but in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, just the opposite. We don't paskin like Abba Shol, and therefore, just like the adult Eved goes free, so too the minor Eved goes free. So, Amar le Reb Zera le Reb Chia bar Abba beferish shemiyalach o michlala shemiyalach. So Reb Zera asks Reb Chia, did you actually hear Reb Yochanan say that explicitly, that we paskin like the Chachamim? Or did you infer it from another general statement? My klala, what general statement are you referring to? The Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Amar Lefnei Rebbe Nisyashtimi Ploni Avdi Mahu. It's the same case. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi quotes Rebbe as saying that if a man declares his Eved to be Hefker, so they asked Rebbe what else needs to be done. Amar Lahem, Omar Ani, Ein Lo Takana Elo Bishtar. So Rabbi said the only way to completely sever this Eved from being an Eved is to give him a shtar shichlur. Ba'amar Rabbi Yochanan, my time of the Rebbe, Gomar Lala Meisha, Ma'isha Bishtar of Eved Nami Bishtar. And Rabbi Yochanan, the Rabbi Yochanan that we're quoting, said the reason for Rebbe is because we're connecting an Eved to a woman. Just like a woman needs a get, so to an Eved needs a get shichlur. The Kodaikis Mina Kiisha, Ma'isha ben Gedola ben Ketana, Eved Nami ben Gadol ben Katan. And therefore you, Rabbi Chia, want to make an inference from that general statement that if Rabbi Yochanan is comparing an Eved to an Isha, then just like an Isha can acquire severance regardless of whether she's a minor or an adult, so too an Eved Kanani can acquire his freedom, and there's no difference in halacha whether he's a minor or an adult. And therefore, in the case of the ger, we would paskin like the Chachamim that the Eved who's a minor goes free as well. So that's the point that I'm trying to make, says Reb Zera. V'imichlalamai adarabba. So v'imichlalamai. So Reb Chia says back to him, no. So what if I only inferred it? He says, well, then there's a problem, because adarabba dok mino la'ach gisa ma isha isura v'lo mamona af eved nami isura v'lo mamona. Because I could argue like this. I could say just go to the other direction. Just like by an isha, it's an issue of Isser and not Mamon, meaning that the severance that is created by the get is a personal status severance and has nothing to do with the financial wherewithal of the person, so too a severance that's created by a get shichur only addresses the personal status severance but does not address the financial wherewithal of the eved. And therefore, if the eved does not have the financial wherewithal to be kind of himself from hefker, then he would not go free. Maybe taka the halachas like Abba Shol, then according to Rabbi Yochanan. So Amrlei, I hear your point, he says, and therefore beferish shemioli. I heard Rabbi Yochanan say explicitly that we do not paskin like Abba Shol, and therefore the minor eved does go free. Amar Mar. Now let's go back to what Rebbe's statement was. Rebbe's statement was, Amar lahem omer ani ein lo takana ela bishtar. What did Rebbe say? He said that if a man declares his eved to be hefker, the only remedy that will work to make him totally free is by giving him a get shichur. You have to have a writ of emancipation. So v'hatanya, now we're going to challenge this. The challenge is from a totally different direction, and that is that normally we're used to thinking that there is another alternate way for an eved to gain his freedom, even when there is no get shichur that's written for him. And what would that way be? It would be kesef. If I go over to Yankel and I say, Yankel, you have a wonderful slave, I'd like to buy him from you, and I give him the value of the eved to Yankel, is that enough for the eved to become my eved? Or let's say I go over to Yankel and I say, I'd like to purchase the slave's freedom, and I give him the kesef. Wouldn't that be an alternate method in order to emancipate the eved and without requiring a get shichur? From Rebbe's language, it sounds like there's only one option, and that's get shichur, and money does not work. And that's the problem, because Vahatanya Rebbe Omer Ani Afu Nosein Demei Atzmo V'Yotzei Mipnei Shu Kemocholo. But we saw yesterday that when Rebbe was talking about when a person makes his eved as part of hektish, there was a statement that an eved, if he's given the money, he can purchase himself from hektish and go free. So you see that money is an alternate way without even requiring a get shichur for an eved to gain his freedom. So hachi kamar, o bekesef o bishtar, v'hai pokale kaspe. So you're right. What Rebbe means is like this. You're right. There are two methods for an eved to gain his freedom, either through a get shichur or through someone paying for him to go free. However, in a situation where the master has declared his eved to be hefker, then the eved is now valueless, and you cannot use kesef in order to free the eved in that situation. So only in a situation where an eved is valueless, there's only one alternative, and that is the get shichur. That's what Rebbe meant. Ulafuke mehaitana. However, this whole discussion is to disagree, is to point out that we disagree, that Rebbe disagrees with the following Tana, who Taka does say that the only method of releasing an eved is through get shichur, and even kesef is not an acceptable way of emancipating a slave. The Tanya Reb Shimon Omer Mishum Rebbe Akiva Yochel Yehi Kesef Goimer Ba Kederch Shishtar Goimer Ba. If you have a shivcha and you want to free her, you might think that by a man paying kesef, let's say he wants to marry a shivcha, so you might think that paying the master kesef is a way of freeing her, just like the master writing a get shichur. Tamul Omar the Hafdei Lo Nifdasa. Ora'a Kol HaParsha Kula Lo Chufasha Lomar Lecha Shtar Gomer Ba Ve'en HaKesef Gomer Ba. Now, it's a little bit detailed to go into all of the details, but let me just point out that the Gemara here is now citing, this Brisa is now citing a pasuk having to do with the law of a shivcha mechurefes li'ish, a shivcha charufa. Now, a shivcha charufa is a complex halacha which we'll learn later on in another context. However, the whole issue over there is like this. The Torah talks about a situation where a woman who is a shivcha has been already betrothed to an eved ivri, to a Hebrew slave. A Hebrew slave, he's Jewish, but he's allowed to consort with a shivcha kinanis. What the Torah is telling us is that if another man goes ahead and has intimacy with that shivcha who's already been betrothed to an eved ivri, the adulterer is not liable for the death penalty. Even though normally an act of adultery is a capital offense, this situation is not. Why? Because this woman, at least in part, is a shivcha kinanis. Now, without going into too much detail, the Gemara clarifies that pasuk is talking about a woman who is half a shivcha kinanis and half a free woman. So really, she's not really permitted to marry a regular Jewish man. She would be permitted to consort with an Eved Ivri. But the point is that because she's partially a shivcha kinanis, this is not considered to be a full-blown act of adultery, because a shivcha kinanis is not subject to an act of kiddushin. And therefore, only when you sleep with a woman who has achieved full kiddushin with another man have you committed an act of capital adultery. This is therefore not capital adultery, it's a lesser form of adultery, and the penalty for the adulterer is therefore a korban asham and not the death penalty. The point, however, that we're trying to make is the very last statement of that phrase is, the last part, the word of that pasuk is kilo chupasha. Kilo chupasha means that because she was not liberated through a formal writ of emancipation, even if money was paid for her freedom, nonetheless, she still remains at least partially a shivcha kinanis because she did not have a get shichur. Therefore, according to this Tana, you see that the only method of emancipating a shivcha, or an eved for that matter, is through a writ, is through a get shichur, even when money is paid. So therefore, we see a machlokas. According to Rabbi, there are two methods of freeing an eved: kesef or get shichur. According to this Tana, which is Reb Shimon, the only way of freeing an eved is only through get shichur, no matter how much money is thrown at the situation. So the Gemara therefore says, Amar Rami Bar Chama Amar Rav Nachman Halacha Karib Shimon. So the question is, how do we paskin? So Rav Nachman is quoting as saying that we paskin like Rav Shimon, that the only way to free an eved is through a get shichur, and kesef doesn't work. The Rav Yosef Bar Chama Amar Rabbi Yechanan Ein Halacha Karib Shimon, and no, just the opposite. We paskin that kesef does work as an alternative. Ashkeche Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak LaRabba Bar Shila Dahavakoya Pischa Devei Tefila. Once Rav Nachman finds Rabba Bar Shila standing at the doorway of the shul. Amar Le Halacha o Ein Halacha. He asked him, how do we paskin? Do we paskin like Reb Shimon or not? So Amar Le Ani Omer Ein Halacha v'Rabbanan da'asu mimachuza Amri Amar Reb Zera Mishmei Rav Nachman Halacha. That I hold that we don't paskin like Reb Shimon, that kesef is viable. But the Rabbanan who came from Machuza, they said, quoting Reb Zera in the name of Rav Nachman, that the halacha is like Reb Shimon, that kesef does not work. So v'chiasoi l'sura ashkachti l'Reb Chia bar Abin and Amri lei emeli izi gufa de uvda hechi hava. And I was so disturbed by the fact that they paskin that money doesn't work, that when I came to Surah, which was I guess nearby Mechuzah, I asked Reb Chia bar Abin, I said, tell me on what basis is Rav Nachman being quoted as saying that we paskin that kesef doesn't work to free a slave. So Amar Li de'ahi amasa de'havamor shchiv meira asya bachya kamei Amar Le ad emas tishtabed v'tezel hayi'itza. The story went like this. There was a case that came before Rav Nachman as follows. A man is on his deathbed. He has a shivcha kinanis in his possession, and she's crying. She's saying, I know you're going to die soon. I don't want to have to be a shivcha to your children. How much longer do I have to be a shivcha? Have rachmanis on me. So the guy is on his deathbed. He has rachmanis. So what does he do? Shakal kumte shadaba amar la zil kiniha ukini nafsheich. He threw her his cap, and he said, make a kinyan on my cap, and through that kinyan on my cap, you'll also make a kinyan on yourself and acquire your emancipation. So, asu lakami de Rav Nachman, amar lahu lo asa v'lo klum. They asked Rav Nachman, is she free or not? And he said, no, that was null and void. So, man dechaza savra mishum dalacha karab Shimon. So an onlooker who saw this thought that Reb Nachman paskined that even though this is a form of kinyan kesef, it's a kinyan chalipin, which is a form of kinyan kesef, he says that's the reason why we see that Reb Nachman paskins like Reb Shimon, that since there was no get shichur, it's not a valid method of emancipation just to use a kinyan kesef. But the Gemara says velohi. But that's a mistake. That's a mistaken inference. Ela mishum dahavale kelev shel makne. You don't understand. It was a faulty kinyan kesef. That's the reason why it didn't work. Now, why is it a faulty kinyan kesef? Kesef, the way kinyan kesef works is there's a quid pro quo. I give you something, you give me back something. But what happens if the seller is the provider of the object that you're making a kinyan with? Then there's no quid pro quo. There's no consideration. And so that's the issue. That was what the problem is. Like this: if the woman who's the shivcha would have taken off her cap and given it to the master, then that would have worked to emancipate her, because there's an exchange. In exchange for my taking a hold of your cap, you acquire your freedom. But here the master said, here, you take my cap and be kind of, you'll become free. It doesn't work that way. There's no exchange. That's why it didn't work. Not because a kinyan kesef doesn't work, but this was not a kosher kinyan kesef. That's the answer. So the Gemara says, you have no raya as far as Rav Nachman's actions, whether he paskins like Rav Shimon or not. It sounds just the opposite. We would argue that he paskins that kesef does work for an eved to acquire their freedom. Amar of Shmuel bar Achitoi, Amar of Hamnuna Saba, Amar of Yitzchak bar Ashian, Amar of Huna, Amar of Hamnuna, Halacha Kareb Shimon. All of these rabbis are quoted as saying that we paskin like Reb Shimon, that only a get shichur works and not kesef. However, the stomach of the Gemara says Velohi, Ein Halacha Kareb Shimon. We don't paskin that way, and an eved could be kona himself or herself through kesef. Amar of Zera, Amar of Chanina, Amar of Ashi, Amar Rav, Amar Rebbe. Eved shenasa es baschorn b'fnei rabo yatzel lecherus. Now, a related halacha is: what if an eved presents kesef kiddushin to a Jewess in the presence of his master? The very fact that his master is present and is not protesting is a sign that the master has already emancipated the eved, and that is a sign that the eved is free and the kiddushin is chal. Amalei Rabbi Yochanan kol kach yesh biyadcha. So Rabbi Yochanan says, I'm amazed that you have such a Mesorah from Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. However, my tradition is different. Va'ani shayna hakoysev shtar eris l'shivchaso. I have a different teaching, that if a man writes a shtar eris and a man wants to marry his shivcha, and he gives her a shtar that says Harayat mikudeshes li, so Rabbi Meir omer mikudeshes, v'chachamim omer meina mikudeshes. So only Rabbi Meir says that she's legally married, but the chachamim say even though prima facie everything that you see indicates that he's freed her, no, she does not go free. She's not mikudeshes. She's still a shivcha. So just the opposite of what you're quoting from the case of Rebbe, even though it's a slightly different case, because one is where the man is the eved, and here's where the shivcha is the eved, but it's the same related issue. Does an act of marriage indicate freedom of the eved or not? So you quote Rebbe as saying it does, and I quote the Chachamim as saying that it doesn't. So the Gemara says, no, there's a difference between the two. Keda'amar Rabba bar Rav Shila kisharabba hiniach lo tefillin, hachanami kisharabba hisio isha. The difference is as follows, and it needs to be clarified by the Gemara, which we'll see tomorrow. And that is, the difference is, the first case, which Rebbe was saying that the Eved goes free because he gave Kiddushin, is not just that the master was passive. The case over there is that the master actively took the Eved and actively took in a woman and gave the woman to the Eved to marry. That demonstrates that the master is holding that this Eved is a free man, because otherwise the master would not have been an active participant in the Eved's marriage. And that, therefore, is demonstrative that the master has already freed the Eved. In the case of the Shivcha, the master is giving a writ of Kiddushin, and as we'll see from the Gemara as it unfolds, you don't have any raya that the master has already freed the Shivcha. He's demonstrating that he wants to free her and he wants to marry her simultaneously with the same shtar. And that's where there's a machlokes. And that's where there's a problem according to the Chachamim. And that's something that the Gemara will discuss in Mirz Hashem tomorrow. Have a wonderful